Well, welcome everybody and good morning. This is our second educational webinar for our owner banks. Today we'll be exploring cyber risk. Ransomware, funds transfer fraud, business email compromise are all once again happening at unprecedented levels. It seems like it's every year. We're setting new records, unfortunately. The increase of these events is making cyber liability insurance the fastest growing insurance product. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dwight West. He's a graduate of Wake Forest and works out of our Newport News office. Dwight works with businesses to identify and mitigate their exposure, and cyber continues to be one of those large exposures that businesses are facing. So I will turn it over to Dwight for a brief presentation on cyber insurance, and then we'll open it up to questions via the chat function. But again, welcome, and Dwight, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Is my screen being shared properly?
Yes, it is.
Great. Hi, my name's Dwight West. I'm a sales executive with Bankers in the Newport News office, as Zach mentioned. Thanks for attending today's webinar. We've been hearing a lot about cyber attacks and the effect that they have on businesses. A cyber attack can literally be fatal to a business. Studies have shown that 60% of small businesses close within 6 months of falling victim to a cyber attack. But to clarify, these are businesses that do not have a cyber insurance policy. For those that do, the closure rate is less than 10%. For today's webinar, we'll spend about 15 minutes discussing cyber insurance, and then we'll open things up for questions. But feel free to ask your questions as I'm speaking. To ask a question, click the Show Conversation icon at the top of your screen and go ahead and type it in. The purpose of today's webinar is to explain what cyber insurance is and how it can benefit your customers. Of course, benefiting your customers means it can benefit us and your bank as well. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about the claims frequency by industry, the types of claims that we're seeing, what cyber insurance will cover, how to reduce the exposure to cyber attacks, what the state of the cyber insurance market is, and then we'll have questions. While these are the top 5 industries with the most claim frequency, no type of business is immune. Ransomware, unlike data breach, is more agnostic with respect to industry sector. Even nonprofits are being targeted. Let me tell you about what happened to one of my clients. They're a large nonprofit that receives donations from all over the world. One day they got a cashier's check from a donor for $39,850. A few days later, the donor contacted my client requesting that they return $9,850 because his CPA had requested the incorrect amount to be donated. After they sent the money back, the bank notified them that the original cashier's check was not good. Fortunately, this was covered under the funds transfer fraud section of a cyber insurance policy. This is a good example of when cyber insurance does not have to involve computers and high tech. But the frequency, severity, and sophistication of cyber attacks is continuing to grow. Here are just some examples of how cyber claims can occur. You lose a laptop with sensitive data on it, you accidentally click on a phishing email, your website goes down on your busiest day of the year, you use your work email for a service that gets compromised, your software fails, which causes a customer to lose business. Clearly, there are many different ways a cyber claim can happen. Now I'd like to give you some examples of the different types of cyber claims that our insurance companies are seeing. Ransomware attacks. Ransomware can be simple or sophisticated. A simple ransomware attack can lock the system so that it's not difficult for a knowledgeable person to reverse. But sophisticated attacks are more common. They involve a technique called cryptoviral extortion. It encrypts the victim's files, making them inaccessible, and demands a ransom payment to decrypt them. Usually the ransom is made in Bitcoin, which makes tracing and prosecuting the perpetrators difficult. In March 2021, one of our insurance companies, CNA Financial, had to pay $40 million to regain control of its network after a ransomware attack. Many of our clients have experienced ransomware attacks, and I know that many of you have clients who have as well. A coworker of mine insures a doctor's office whose system was recently breached and a ransom of $1.7 million was demanded. Fortunately, they had a good cyber insurance policy, and the insurance company negotiated the ransom down. To date, the insurance company has paid out $550,000, but the claim is still open and more payments are expected. The most frequent and easiest method used by criminals is to launch a funds transfer fraud attack through email phishing or spear phishing. For example, your client's company may receive an email from a vendor providing new wiring instructions for the funds and explaining, hey, because of COVID-19, our bank has been working slowly and we're switching to a new account. Your client works with this vendor often and doesn't think to question the request. Fraudsters also gain control of online banking transactions through malware or other techniques that allow hackers to take over user accounts and circumvent controls. For example, a spoofed email contains a malicious link or attachment, which allows the hackers to gain access to the company's banking credentials, like username, password, access to temporary PIN, or token credentials. The hacker then logs into the bank's website and instructs the bank to transfer funds to a fraudulent account. A business email compromise, as we discussed in the previous slide, this is just the method that criminals use to successfully obtain funds through a fraudulent transfer. Data breach is when sensitive, protected, or confidential information is copied, transmitted, viewed, or stolen, or used by someone who is not authorized to do so. One of the largest security breaches in history was Target in 2013, when cyber criminals were able to steal 40 million credit and debit records and 70 million customer records. Interestingly, this data breach started with an HVAC contractor. This contractor's only data connection to Target was a billing system. Target paid an $18.5 million settlement, but said the breach actually cost them $202 million. I just heard from a colleague of mine who had a client that he had recently provided a cyber insurance application to, but the client had not yet completed and signed it. This was an orthopedic doctor's office. My coworker got a call from them that their system had been breached and patient records had been stolen. Now, fortunately, they had a business liability policy that gave them a sub-limit of $25,000. That insurance company immediately paid it because clearly the loss was well in excess of that amount. But this loss would have been much better covered with a standalone cyber insurance policy. A few years ago, stealing credit card or personal data was more common. But as you can see from this slide, today, ransomware and business email compromise are the key drivers of industry change in cyber insurance underwriting, capacity, pricing, strategy. In the first half of 2021, ransomware attacks increased by 102%. So this is just a brief overview of some of the areas that may be covered by cyber insurance. So breach response costs will cover legal fees, forensics, public relations, credit monitoring, things like that. Ransomware, think about this. The average claim last year, was $570,000. Now, the easiest way to recover from a ransomware attack is to simply pay the ransom. But the insurance companies don't like to do that. They try to avoid paying the ransom and instead recover from backups and encryption. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Stolen funds. The average claim went from $117,000 in 2020 to $326,000 in 2021. That's an incredible jump. Funds transfer fraud is becoming more and more common. Lost business income, of course, when your client system is down, they can't operate efficiently. Computer replacements, sometimes computers that are damaged by a virus need to be replaced. Technology failures, and much more. So these are some of the things that can be done to reduce the exposure to a cyber attack. Multi-factor authentication on email. If there's one thing for you to remember from this presentation, it's how important MFA is for your clients to implement. One of our carriers has had 0 business email compromise claims from clients who have implemented MFA. Endpoint detection and response software goes above and beyond antivirus software. It looks at the behavioral elements of how ransomware attackers operate. Now, secure offline backups. The backup strategy today isn't what it was 5 or 10 years ago. Back then it was, hey, if our building burns down, do we get our data back? Today, it's more like if somebody gets inside our network and actively targets our backups, will we still have any data left? One of the carriers told us the best recovery is from tapes because of the physical separation. Backups on the cloud are encrypted, which makes restoring them after an attack more problematic. Now, avoid external network exposures. One example of an external network exposure is remote desktop protocol. RDP is a software developed by Microsoft to connect to another computer over a network connection. The use of RDP without proper controls in place can make your network vulnerable to attacks. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I did hear an IT security person at one of our insurance companies refer to RDP as ransomware delivery protocol. I think that was just a geek trying to be funny. But in addition to doing everything you can to avoid a loss, the chances are high that a loss will still occur. So purchasing a cyber insurance policy will provide much needed protection when it happens. We'll talk a little bit more about the state of the cyber insurance market in a minute, but the one thing that is driving the changes in the market is the increased criminal activity. The first half of last year, the incidence of cyber attacks increased by 125%. And there's talk now about Russia instigating an all-out cyber war. What effect will that have on the cyber insurance market? So let me just tell you a little bit about what's going on in the cyber insurance market. It's still a relatively new insurance product, but we've seen some significant changes in just the last 2 years. For instance, premiums are up an average of 96% last year. Policy changes, lower limits are being imposed for certain exposures. Deductibles are being increased by multiples of what they were the prior year. Coinsurance is being added for certain exposures. Exclusions or coverage restrictions are being added. From a capacity standpoint, many carriers are not able to offer the same high limits that they used to. And in underwriting, we've seen several clients that have been non-renewed due to a lack of fundamental cybersecurity loss controls, such as not implementing multi-factor authentication. Insurance companies are asking more questions. It takes a lot longer to get renewal quotes. But here's something positive. One of the carriers we represent will perform a free security scan on the client during the underwriting process. This helps detect any vulnerabilities they may have in their system. They like to say, we underwrite like an adversary. Now, the regulatory environment is dynamic. Things are always changing. The US is still a patchwork of policies, but there have been good regulations adopted in other countries that are likely to be adopted here. Look, it's clear that the cyber insurance market has hardened quite a bit, but that does not mean that this product is not affordable or worthy of acquiring. In fact, I would ask, can your client afford not to be protected? So today we learned that cyber attacks are on the rise, as are the losses that result from those attacks. We've also learned some of the ways your clients can reduce their exposure to such losses. One way is cyber insurance. We learned how cyber insurance can respond to the needs of your clients after they have experienced a cyber attack. And finally, we learned more about what is happening in the cyber insurance marketplace. Someone pointed out to me the other day that banks require fire insurance for homes that they've helped to finance. But the chances of a business experiencing a cyber attack are 161 times more likely than that of a house fire. The Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, FFIEC, recommends that banks require commercial lending customers have cyber insurance to supplement existing risk management programs. I know one of the banks we have a relationship with is talking about requiring cyber insurance for all of their commercial loans. At Bankers Insurance, we represent many reputable insurance companies that are able to write standalone cyber insurance policies. And most of our companies are able to incorporate cyber insurance into the client's existing fire and general liability policy. But not all cyber policies are the same. Usually, the coverages and limits that are included in a typical business insurance policy are not as robust as those in the standalone cyber insurance policy. Case in point is the example I gave you earlier of the orthopedic client. Of course, we at Bankers Insurance do a lot more than just cyber insurance. So the next time you talk to your clients, please let them know that your bank owns an insurance agency and we can assist them in analyzing their insurance portfolio to ensure that they have the proper coverages in place. Please use your traditional referral process to put your client in touch with the agent at Bankers who should reach out to them. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're here to help your clients, and in doing so, help your bank as well. So now we're going to have the opportunity to answer any questions you might have, and I'm not sure if there were any that were in the chat box while I was talking, but Zach, if there were, let me know what they are.
Yes, I have two that have popped up. So the first is, what size business client does it make sense to refer to Bankers Insurance? And along that same note, do they have to have their commercial insurance with Bankers Insurance to buy cyber insurance? So as it relates to the first question, as on the size of the business client, we want to be able to help all of your clients. And so as it relates to the clients that you're working with, there's not really a size limitation on the businesses that we're going to help. And do they have to have their commercial insurance with Bankers Insurance to buy cyber? Absolutely not. It is in the client's best interest for us to do a cyber review along with the other lines of coverage, because there are some coverages that kind of cross over each other. In particular, the crime policy and the cyber policy can both react to cyber claims in different ways. So we would ask, if we are providing a cyber quote for a client, that we're able to review their entire program so we see what's going on.
Good point. And it's certainly a good foot in the door.
Yeah. Well, and then we had another question as it relates to distributing today's slides. We can absolutely do that to attendees, and we'll also be sending out an edited video to all of our member banks to be able to so you can watch it and share with your broader teams, because I know everybody couldn't make it this morning. I've got another question here. For a standard business and $500,000 in coverage, what is the cost?
Well, that's going to vary based on the business, based on the revenues. Generally, the premium is revenue driven more than anything else, is what I found. There's also, it takes about, I don't know, 2 minutes, I think, to fill out an application. It's pretty quick, but there are a lot of yes, no questions, and hopefully all of the answers are no to most of these questions, because if there's a yes, it either makes it, undesirable or it makes it more expensive. But it's generally based on the revenues of the business, and we can get a quote. And like I said, it doesn't take much more than a couple of minutes to get a quote. Some of them are online, and we can get it very quickly.
Yeah. And I would say, Dwight, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe what do you think our average quote on cyber would be? Roughly. I mean, it varies between probably $600 to a couple $100,000.
Well,
But
yeah,
the average range is probably maybe $2,000 to
correct.
$3,000 is
Yep.
where I would put that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of $600 ones, but I would say at least $1,000 is going to be kind of a minimum. And we like to quote $1 million in coverage, but a $500,000 is sometimes it's doable at most of our companies. And so I'd say average is going to range between 1,000 and maybe 25 or $3,000 in that range.
And one other note on the quoting, the cyber risk analysis that the carriers will do on the clients, in the underwriting process, to be able to show them vulnerabilities in their website, has been a very nice tool for us, but also the clients, because now all of a sudden they realize and we can identify vulnerabilities to help mitigate that risk immediately, and then help drive that the cyber insurance quote down as well. So that's been something we've been had a lot of success with, and a lot of positive feedback from our clients. Got another question, Dwight. Can cyber coverage be included under a general liability umbrella to cover larger potential claims?
The answer is sometimes. Sometimes the insurance companies have the ability to do cyber insurance on the business package policy for higher limits. Sometimes they just have these sub limits that can be raised a little bit, but not a lot. So the answer is sometimes, quite honestly.
We've got another question. Can you provide a presentation to our clients in a group setting? And absolutely, we can do these both virtually, and as we continue to move along and have more in-person meetings, we would love to do it with you and your teams in a client-facing seminar. But we're offering this both in a webinar format and also physical presentations as long as it makes sense. It's a great question.
And I think it's probably fine if they wanted to forward the recording to one of their clients to watch.
Is it available as a rider or solely as a separate policy?
Well, that's it is the answer is both. Most of our insurance companies will provide it as a rider, as an inclusion to the business liability policy. That's not as good a coverage. That's usually lower limits, not as broad coverage, things like that. But that is, most all of our companies are already doing that. But if you want a more robust cyber coverage, you should take out a standalone cyber insurance policy that's going to have higher limits and much better coverages. The companies are going to do things like security scans when they're doing the underwriting process and everything else.
And as Dwight mentioned on that, just one more comment. As it relates to the sublimits, oftentimes carriers put a sublimit on an existing policy so that if it goes to court, they know that's the max out of pocket. So oftentimes sublimits can be looked at as a positive, but sometimes I see as a negative because it's really limiting that liability of carriers. So when cyber came about, it wasn't really addressed in policies. So carriers immediately put smaller sublimits to limit their exposure. And sometimes those sublimits are fine depending upon the business, but oftentimes it's not enough coverage. And then,
And good example of that is the orthopedic client that I just gave, that
yeah,
the sublimit was 25,000. The insurance company wrote the check and said, we're done.
and as it relates to referrals, please use your existing referral channel. We just had a question about cyber referrals, but please go through your traditional channel, and we'll determine if it makes sense for Dwight or a local representative to work, just depending upon the situation. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so we'll let you get out a little bit early this morning, but thank you all for your continued support. Cyber risk is real, and it's one of those things that we just want to have the conversation prior to a breach than after. So please reach out to us for any questions or guidance. And again, thank you so much for your time this morning, and you'll have a wonderful day.